Today I'm going to be testing out a photo transfer method using Mod Podge. And I've actually tested it out once already on this little piece of wood here. But I wanted to do some more testing with some different transfer materials and just some different artwork. So I'm going to be testing this transfer method on some freezer paper. I also have some parchment paper. I have some of the backing left over from contact paper, and also an empty sticker sheet label for my printer. So I'm going to be testing out the transfer method on all of these different papers. They have similar qualities, but they're not exactly the same. I'm anticipating that all of them will work, but I could be wrong. So the first thing I want to do is I need to cut my contact paper backing, the parchment paper, and the freezer paper into 8.5 by 11 sheets. So obviously if you have the label sticker paper left over, the backing from that will be the fastest route. But if you have these other papers, you can cut them to the size of your printer paper and use them in your printer as well. So I've got my 3 papers cut here, and the contact paper, backing, and the freezer paper are a little bit, they want to curl up. So you're going to want to reverse the curl on those so that they will lay flat with the sort of waxy or shiny side facing up. And the parchment paper is way too thin to run through your printer. So I'm going to trim down my piece of parchment paper a little bit and then just tape it to a regular sheet of printer paper. And obviously this label sticker paper is already ready to go. So on the parchment paper, you will not be able to use the full sheet, so you might not be able to make your image quite as big. But you're not going to want to print right to the edge of any of these probably, so it won't make a huge difference, hopefully. I've used the parchment paper on a previous test run for this, and so I know that it works, but the other thing that happens with the parchment paper, and I'm not sure if it's going to happen with the other papers, is that as you apply the Mod Podge, it's going to buckle a little bit. And it does flatten out as you work with it, but the parchment paper definitely buckles up. The other thing is that the tape doesn't stick very well to the parchment paper. And because I'm going to be running this through my printer, I want to make sure that I have the edges taped really smoothly and cleanly so that the paper won't get caught in my printer. And here again, these papers are not going to tape very well, but I am going to get a little bit of painter's tape to paint down the corners, just because as you start applying the Mod Podge, the paper does tend to curl up a little bit. You want to be sure to get all of your excess sticker paper off of your sticker label page here. So I'm going to be using a fairly large paintbrush. And I'm just going to go over each of the sheets with a very light, thin coat of Mod Podge. And what I do is, in the past I've put 6 layers of Mod Podge on, so that's what I'm going to do this time. And what I do is I'll brush one direction for one coat and then the opposite direction for the next coat. And sometimes you can do a diagonal brush if you want to, just to smooth out all of your brush strokes. There will be some texture on the paper, and the Mod Podge just has texture when you apply it, so you're not going to have a totally smooth surface. And especially as you're starting out, the Mod Podge will kind of pool up and ball up, and you won't get complete coverage, but that's why you're going to do several coats. So I'm just brushing on a coat. I'm not going all the way to the edge of my paper. I'm not sure if you can tell, but this is the parchment paper, and it is already kind of balling up a little, or crinkling up a little bit. I don't know if that's because the moisture gets in the paper, but but it does sort of ripple. And this sheet is the label, the backing of the label stickers. If you want to and you're impatient, I'll probably do this. You can use a hair dryer to have the glue dry a little bit faster. But you want to definitely just start with a very thin layer and just keep adding thin layers one at a time until you have 6 layers of Mod Podge. I don't know if you can see this on screen, but this is the backing paper for contact paper, and you can definitely see that this is not sticking as well, I guess is what I would say. It's kind of pooling up and separating, but just get as smooth of a coat as you can, and then we'll go back with the next coat. And then this is the wax paper, or the freezer paper. So there is the parchment paper. You can definitely see it's rippling. This is the backing of the sticker labels. And that's the freezer paper. And that's the backing for the contact paper. I've got the 6 coats of Mod Podge on all of my samples here, and just to show you how they kind of finish, this is the parchment paper, and you can see that it's very rippled. It's kind of a toss-up as far as how much rippling in the next 2 pieces. This is the backing for the label paper. This is the backing for the contact paper. And the flattest piece is the freezer paper. But you can see a lot of texture on all of these samples. So I'm going to carefully untape all of these samples now and see if I can't get them a little more flattened out. If you get any tape or any glue on the tape, you want to be very careful peeling it off, because it will pull all of your glue layer off of your paper. Now that the contact paper backing is free of the tape, it's laying pretty flat too, I would say. The freezer paper is definitely the flattest. And this label paper backing is probably the most rippled of these 3. But I think it'll go through the printer just fine. So I did this before, and I think I'm going to repeat this process. Because this because the parchment paper is so crinkly, I'm going to cut it off of this paper and put it on a new sheet, because I think I'll be able to smooth it out a little bit better. So my retaping job isn't perfect, but it did help a little bit, and certainly the backing paper is no longer rippled. So I think it will feed through the printer much better now. All right, I'm ready to print, so I'm going to start with my contact paper backing sheet. And I'm just using an inkjet printer. Now, the only thing you want to kind of watch, at least with my printer, is to make sure your paper is feeding through straight, because it's already kind of leaning a little bit. So there's the first sheet, and just be sure not to touch the ink because it doesn't actually dry, so you want to be very careful not to smudge your ink. So there's the first one. I'm going to use my freezer paper next. You might not be able to see this, but all of these papers are a little bit floppy because of the weight of the Mod Podge. So just a caution, you might not want to run these through your very expensive printer. My printer is not terribly expensive, and you can see that the way that the paper feeds through, I can kind of help it. There's not a lot of places for the paper to get jammed up. I've certainly gotten my printers jammed up with paper before. It's usually pretty easy to get the paper out and unjam the paper, but certainly it's your choice whether you want to run this kind of medium through your printer. And then I've got the label paper. That print quality isn't quite as good on my parchment paper. And I don't know if it's my ink running out or because of the ripples. I got a few little extra marks on the print here, but this is already maybe your last resort choice just because it takes some extra steps. So part of my test was to see how these products went through the printer and how the print quality was. And not surprisingly, the print quality was fairly similar because you're actually printing on the Mod Podge in every case. So that wasn't terribly surprising. But the second test I want to run is to make sure that all of these papers will release the Mod Podge and actually do the transfer. So I'm going to test the transfer method on several different materials, but also I wanted to test each of the different backing materials on that material. So I'm going to use one of my little psychedelic dogs here. And I've got a sample from each of the backing papers. And I'm going to start by just doing transfer onto this cardboard chipboard. So to do this transfer method, you're going to want your iron and a piece of parchment paper that's big enough to cover your art. So my iron is heating on a medium heat setting. My iron goes from 1 to 7 and I've got it on 4, so it's right in the middle, heating up. And before I do these transfers, I want to trim down my edges here. The Mod Podge does show up even where there's no ink, so I'm going to have kind of a square area that the Mod Podge is going to show up on. Wow, I'm cutting that really crooked. Perhaps I should have used a ruler. So if you have a really simple piece of art, or if your art is square, you won't have this excess Mod Podge showing. You could cut your art out, but again, if you do, you're going to want to be very careful about not smudging your ink. So I'm just going to go with kind of this trimmed off shape for my first test. And I'm going to start with my parchment paper actually, because I know that the parchment paper will release the Mod Podge and do the transfer. So I'm going to trim off my excess again, as I mentioned, so that I can have as little extra glue showing as possible. Now this transfer is not going to be perfect because of the tape, it didn't quite fit onto my paper, so I'm going to trim it and see what happens here. But part of my print is on the tape. So for this one, you want to make sure that you're getting your parchment paper and removing your printer paper, so you want to make sure that you get that out of the way. And then I'm going to take my first chipboard sample and I'm going to flip my art over and just lay it down. So if you're doing any wording, you're going to want to mirror your image before you print it. Otherwise it will read backwards. So I'm going to lay the parchment paper over the top just because sometimes the glue can seep out around the edges a little bit and you want to protect your iron. And I like using the parchment paper because you can see through it and you can make sure you didn't move your art around at all. So I'm going to take my iron and I'm just going to place it on top of my art for 15 seconds. Now this piece of art is small enough that I can cover the whole thing with my iron. So I'm going to just press it down once and then I'll move the iron and do another 15 seconds. If you have larger art, you're going to have to kind of carefully move across your piece, but you don't want to rub your iron. You want to just set it down and pick it up and set it down again. So I'm going to set this down for 15 seconds. Lift it up and just move my iron around and do another 15 seconds. Maybe you can see this. You can see the little edge here where the glue did seep out. So that's why you want to have your parchment paper on there. Now I'm going to let this whole thing cool off. And I forgot one little tip on the application. So let's do this one more time. We'll take this next sample, which is the freezer paper. And looks like I need to trim it down just a little bit more. The tip is for actually being able to remove the backing once the piece has cooled off. Sometimes it's a little hard to get a hold of just the backing paper and get it started so that you can peel it off. So what I like to do is before I apply it, I like to peel off a little piece of the paper. So you can see I've got them separated here. And I'm just going to fold back the paper. So I've got a little corner that I can get a hold of. Got to try to do that without smudging my ink here. All right, so I'm going to lay it in place again, and then I've got my little corner folded back, and I'm going to put my parchment paper on top again to protect my iron, and then I'll do my 15 seconds, move the iron, in another 15 seconds. And I'm just going to do that on all my samples. All right, so we're at the moment of truth here. As I mentioned, I know that the parchment paper will release the artwork. So I've got my parchment paper here. I've got the freezer paper here. This is the backing from the contact paper, and this is the backing from the label paper. So I'm going to start with my parchment paper here, and fortunately, well, I've got tape on here, so we'll have to just ignore that part. But fortunately, this was easy to get a hold of. So you can just peel the paper off, and you've got your transfer here. Now, a couple of things. You can see the edge here. So I might go back with just my bigger piece of parchment paper and try to get those edges down a little better. And then you'll have to ignore this part here because this is where the tape is, that because my art was too big for that sheet of paper. But you can see that the paper comes right off and your image is nice and clear. Next up is the freezer paper, and here's my little corner that I peeled back, which will make it easier to get a hold of, hopefully. I think I've got it caught under the glue, like the glue kind of comes back over the top. So I have a weeding tool from my Cricut cutting machine. I think a little paring knife might also work. Just any little sort of delicate, sharp thing that you can get under the paper so that if it's caught anywhere, you can peel it back. So that came off really nicely as well. Again, I have the edges of the glue that I'm going to go back and try to flatten those out with a bigger sheet of parchment paper. I suspect that might be happening on all of these samples. This is the contact paper, and you can see that it comes right off as well. And last we have the label paper. So you can see that all of these papers do work for this transfer method. So for my next material, I'm testing the transfer on a piece of wood, and I've already applied 3 of my papers using the same ironing, timing, and method. But because you might not be able to see this, but I can already see that there's a little bit of glue kind of that's squeezed out from this transfer. And hopefully you can see this on the screen, but there you can see that there's just a little ridge of the glue that's showing on this sample. And on this one, I did go back and just press it down with a bigger piece of parchment paper. But I'm thinking that there might be another method for actually doing the transfer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel back this whole piece and just remove the paper from the very beginning. So this is my freezer paper sample, and I'm hoping that I can remove this without really stretching anything. You want to try to not pull in any I can feel the glue kind of stretching a little bit, but so this might not work if you have a really big piece, but for this smaller section, this smaller transfer, I was able to get this off, and now I'm just going to lay it in place. Now I want to be sure I'm flipping it over, and it's a little trickier to work with, so you can decide which method you like the best. And then I'm just going to lay my parchment paper over the top and apply my 15-second intervals of pressing. So now I want to be sure to let this sheet of parchment paper cool off before I remove it. I forgot to fold back a corner on my parchment paper again, so I'm having trouble getting finding a spot to pull the paper off. There we go. If you're patient, you can figure it out. So there's my parchment paper sample, and you can see there's a little edge there that you probably would want to address. This is the label paper. I'm not sure what's happening here, but I'm having some difficulty getting this contact paper backing off of this wood sample. It's definitely pulling up right here at this spot. I'm going to put a little more heat on it, but I'm going to be patient and really let that cool off this time before I try to remove the paper anymore. So here are the wood samples. This first one is the parchment paper. And you can see on his ear where the print job got a little messed up. Then we have the label paper. And I was able to get all of the paper backing off of the contact paper, but it did pull up in this area and kind of stretch. So there was a little bubble. I wasn't able to get it to really stick to the wood with the iron, but I was able to press it in place with my finger, and you really can't see that there was a problem now, but it was a little disconcerting at first. And then this is the freezer paper that I put on without the backing. So I'm not sure what happened here, but the ink did bleed a little bit. You know, this is in the glue itself, but the ink bled into the glue layer. So I don't know if that was because I took it off the backing first, or if that's just something you need to be careful of in all cases. But that was one little oopsie that happened on the freezer paper sample. So the wood is a little less smooth than the cardboard pieces that I used before, but I think you still get a nice transfer with all of these products. The next test I'm going to run is on fabric, and I'm going to go ahead and cut out my little dog shapes so there is no edge around them. I'm going to be using the exact same method for application as the other two materials, but because I have a little bit thinner material here and it's more porous, I have an extra piece of parchment paper underneath my fabric here so that I can just protect my table. So before I pull these papers off, I did want to just make one last comment about the different papers, and that is that if you needed to see your placement and kind of where you were putting things, obviously the most transparent piece is the parchment paper, and the hardest piece of paper to see through is the label backing. The freezer paper and the contact paper are kind of similar. There's a little bit of transparency there. So just something else to keep in mind when you're choosing your material. All right, so all these samples look great, but of course if you're printing on fabric, the one question you probably have is, can you wash it? So let's throw these in the washer and at least find out how they come through one washing. For my final test, I put the transfers on some flattened aluminum sheets. And the notable thing about the aluminum is that it is probably the smoothest surface that I applied my transfers to. And the fun thing about that is that you can really see the texture from the glue. The other thing that's notable is that I wasn't 100% sure that this would actually stick to the aluminum just because it's metal, and you might be able to peel this off, but I was actually concerned that I might just pull the transfer off with the paper when I removed the paper. But it does stick to the aluminum, so that's another thing you could apply your transfers to. So I've got my fabric samples out of the wash and dry, and just to let you know my method, I washed them in cold water and then I dried them on low heat in my dryer. And the first thing I noticed was that all of these samples were actually stuck to the inside of my dryer when I went to pull them out. Now, they did come off pretty easily, and I don't think I lost any of the glue or the print, but that's just something to keep in mind if you want to do this process. I did have one lower heat setting on my dryer, which was a delicate setting, which maybe I would try if I did this again. But you might want to just forego drying these in your dryer because they, like I said, did kind of stick to my dryer. I don't think it hurt anything, but it was a little surprising. The other thing is I was expecting to get very similar results on all of these, and I don't know how clear it is on the screen, but my parchment paper and my contact paper, especially the contact paper, really seemed to bleed, and you can see how it's a little more faded than this other sample. Now, I thought that I would get very similar results on all of these because the print is on the Mod Podge and the paper has nothing, the backing paper has nothing to do with it at this point. So my guess is that maybe these two samples that didn't bleed quite as much, this one bled a little bit, the label paper. The freezer paper is really the best. I don't see any bleeding on it at all, and it did maintain all of the vibrant color. But what I started to say is that it may have more to do with the amount of ironing that I did, so that maybe these two darker samples had a little bit more heat and a little more time, and the ink mixed with the glue a little bit more, so it sealed the ink from the backside. Because if you're thinking about this in layers, you've got 6 layers of Mod Podge on the top, then you've got your ink, and then you've got your fabric. So I'm assuming that the reason that these washed out was because the water and heat were coming through the fabric to get to the ink. So you could try sealing your piece from the back. You could add a little bit of sealer. On these you can see very easily where you would want to put a little more Mod Podge. If you're using a heavier fabric, that could be problematic. The other thing is that you are definitely adding some stiffness to your fabric. So those are all just things to keep in mind if you're using this transfer method on fabric, and if you want it to be on something that's washable, you probably want to do a little testing first to make sure that you have the ink sealed from both sides. So I wouldn't say that this was a complete fail by any means, but it definitely could use some modifications and a little more testing. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, I'd love for you to click that subscribe button to join my YouTube community. Also, if you'd like to receive the Upcycled Design Lab newsletter, check the description box for a place to sign up. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you back here soon in the lab for my next experiment.